All right. So tonight our lesson topic is who are the 12? Who are the 12 disciples? And for those of you that can see the screen, I can promise you they did not look like this. All right? This is most of our paintings and such is Renaissance era paintings, and most painters like to make people look the way they looked a lot of times, and so that is why they look like this, but more than likely they did not look like this. And I am not sure, at least in this picture, who is necessarily who either. I would say maybe that's John, and maybe that's Paul, and the others, I don't know, okay? So, I think that's definitely Thaddeus. Look at that. Yep, looks like a Thaddeus. All right, so tonight we're talking about who are the 12, and our text is coming from Mark chapter 3. So we're going through the Gospel of Mark, and I'm trying to pick out some things that may be good for some discussion or for a class-type setting also, instead of just a sermon setting. But this is Mark chapter 3, starting in verse 13, where we have one of the list, okay? One of the list of the disciples. We are given a list here. We're given a list 3 other times in the other Gospels also. It says, he went up onto the mountain and called to him those he himself wanted. And they came to him, and he appointed 12, that they might be with him, that he might send them out to preach, and to have power to heal sicknesses and to cast out demons. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, or thunder. That is, sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him, and they went into a house. All right? So here are the 12 names of what is referred to as many times the 12 disciples, or sometimes we give them another name, which is the 12 what? Apostles. And what does it mean to be an apostle? All right? One who is with Jesus, definitely an apostle, at least the qualifications usually we talk about of an apostle, is someone who was with Jesus or was personally taught by Jesus. And that's where Paul fits into a little bit of a different category. You know, he was personally taught by Jesus. He was not taught by Jesus here with these others. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, what is an apostle? Okay, one who is sent. All right? That is the technical idea of an apostle. Literally means one who is sent out. Well, if you look right here, that he might send them out. Okay? So, other contexts, they're known as the apostles. Mark's favorite terminology for them is not the disciples, is not the apostles, but his favorite thing to call them is simply what? The 12. Okay? He just refers to them as the 12. Why 12? It's an even number, okay? That way you can have 5 on offense, 5 on defense, and 1 sub for each team. Makes perfect sense, okay? Okay, so it could be completely random, coincidental, that just happened to be 12 people. But I don't think that's the case, all right? I think that 12 is significant because we realize in the Old Testament that there were How many tribes? No, there was more than 12 tribes. But it was known as the 12 tribes, right? Because you actually had, what? You had Levi also, and then you had the two sons of Joseph. But anyway, we refer to them as the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And so, since we refer to them as the 12 tribes of Israel, we have in a way Jesus recreating that. I think something else that's interesting, at least in our narrative here tonight, is that Jesus goes up on the mountain and there he calls these 12. Maybe reminiscent of Moses going up on the mountain. Of course, this entire scene will be played out in Matthew and in chapter 5, or the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5, where we have what we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And there we see Jesus becoming perhaps the new lawgiver, just like Moses was. Yes, sir. Okay, is the title apostle reserved for anyone other than that 12? So the term apostle is a generic term, okay? It can be the 12 apostles, capital A, or it can be an apostle, anyone who is sent out. In that way, there is other times that people who do not fit into the 12 are referred to as apostles, okay? So you'll find like Paul referring to James, who the brother of Jesus, James, as an apostle, okay? He was not the James, he is not this James, he is not this James, he is not this James, he's a different James, okay? Lots of Jameses there in the New Testament. But he is referred to as an apostle because he is one who is also sent out, or one who is sent out on a mission. So you have your technical term apostle, and you have your generic term apostle. Very similar, like the word kuros, Lord, can be referred to someone who is Lord, like a sir, or someone who is the Lord. Right? You have Messiah, someone who is anointed. There's many Messiahs that are mentioned in the Old Testament, or that is the Messiah, okay? So that's kind of the difference that are there. Any other questions as far as general idea with the apostles / disciples? Philip?
So when Jesus dies,
right? Right. He is kind of, so this is not in the context of what we're discussing tonight, but when Judas Iscariot dies, then you have Matthias, who is added there in Acts chapter 1. You have another disciple is going to die later on in the book of Acts. Talk about him in just a moment. And then Paul is referred to as an apostle. He definitely is an apostle, and we can call him the 13th apostle if you want to, or we can stop doing the numbers and just call him an apostle, or one of the apostles. It is interesting that only Judas Iscariot is the only one that is quote-unquote replaced, if you will. They don't continue. It's not a seat that has continued to be filled every time somebody dies, okay? There is no living apostles today. There's people who claim to be apostles who have after their name and before their name, perhaps apostle so-and-so, but as far as the New Testament is concerned, once these apostles and Matthias and Paul died, that was the end of the apostles. And as far as the qualifications that are given in Acts chapter 1, no one else fits that other than Paul, who was a special case and spent time with Jesus in Arabia. And you can read Galatians chapter 1 and 2 chapter 2 about that. All right, so let's talk about who are the 12, okay? And we're going to start with the first one that is mentioned in our text, and I just basically copied and pasted from the text. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. All right? Simon, Peter, is given several different names. He is called Simon, he is called Peter, he is called Simon Peter, and he is also called Cephas. All right? Which is his correct name? All of them. Okay? You'll notice that as we go throughout this list is that many of these names are not necessarily their given names, but are their nicknames. Okay? And the same thing is true for Peter. His given name seems to be Simon, and his nickname is Peter. And who gave him the nickname Peter? It is Jesus. Now, this is something that's interesting, is that we know from the Gospel of Matthew him giving that name, but here Mark, and he talks about later on in Mark too, in Mark 8, but here Mark go ahead and he foreshadows that. He is not called Peter yet, but Mark is already referring to him as Peter because that is what he is known as. Okay? Peter is important because he is part of the inner circle. All right, there is an inner circle of disciples, it seems to be, that is made up of Peter and who else? James and John. Okay, they have special access, it seems to be. They're a part of an inner circle, perhaps, of Jesus' disciples. But in all the list, and any time where there can be multiple disciples listed, Peter is always mentioned first. Why? Why is he mentioned first? I'm sorry, say it again.
The first person that Jesus contacted.
All right, he's the first person that Jesus contacted in saying to follow me. That would be a great answer, but that is incorrect. Okay? Because Peter was not the first disciple. Yes, Philip. Right. Okay, perhaps the plans for Peter were bigger. Peter is the one that is many times the most outspoken. And there in Matthew chapter 16, that's where he is given that name, Peter, and upon this rock, referring to the confession that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. I will build my church. And he told Peter that he would give them, not only Peter, but the rest of the apostles, also the keys of the kingdom. Okay? But still, that's probably not the reason why he is always first. Yes, Ron? More than likely, it's a really simple answer that Peter is the oldest of them all. And so that is why he is being listed first. We know almost for sure, just the way that it is written, that he is older than Andrew, his brother. And more than likely, he is the oldest of all of them. And he becomes the de facto spokesperson a lot of times of the disciples. Of course, it is Peter who on the day of Pentecost seems to be the spokesperson. It is Peter that is a spokesperson for the disciples in other contexts also. Sometimes it is not good to be the spokesperson. Okay? Sometimes he speaks too quickly about things. But more likely, the reason why he is mentioned first is just because he's the oldest. Okay? And that is why he is mentioned first. What are some of Peter's claims to fame? So what? He makes the great confession or the good confession. Definitely. What else? He delivers the first gospel sermon in its entirety. And I clarify that because it's not the first gospel sermon because Jesus preached the gospel sermon, but it's the first gospel sermon that includes the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. What else does Peter do? All right, he's the one that denies Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows, right? What else does Peter do? All right, he cuts off a guy's ear, okay? Either he's a really good swordsman or a really lousy one, right? Maybe he is doing it purposely and he's like, I could have killed you, but I didn't, right? Or maybe he's just, and he just slings his sword and cuts off an ear. Peter is one of the only people to have ever done what? Walk on water. That's a pretty cool claim to fame, right? Can you imagine hanging out with your grandkids? Come here, kids. Let me tell you something about old granddad. I walked on water. Yep, I did, right? So that definitely is a claim to fame, okay? Peter's got definitely, you can do an entire series of lessons just on Peter as a character study, on things that happened in his life. And then, of course, Peter also has 2 books that are attributed to him, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. And what's interesting, especially about 1 Peter, is you can do some correlation between the life of Peter and some of the things that are written in 1 Peter. One of my favorite things is in 1 Peter, in chapter 1, where it talks about in, I think, verse 13, where he says, gird, this is the more literal translation, gird up the loins of your mind. And thinking about girding up the loins, that is exactly what a servant would do before they are to wash someone's feet. And perhaps Peter is thinking back to the washing of the feet of the disciples there in John chapter 13. So that's about Peter, all right? We were talking about his writings. What about his death? How does Peter die? All right, tradition says that he is crucified upside down. All right, that he does not want to be crucified in the same way that Jesus is crucified. He does not think himself worthy, and so that he is crucified upside down. We don't know that for a fact, but that is the tradition. Yes, sir. So he's more often used than others as an object for teaching. I think the reason why is because he more often than others opens his big mouth. So it's not that Jesus is like, all right, Peter, come here, you're my favorite example, let me use you. It's that Peter goes, blah, and then Jesus has to go, okay, well, let's talk about this. So definitely he is one that seems to like to speak, and his speaking is what's going to get him in trouble sometimes, but then in the end, it is his speaking that also brings the gospel. All right, next, James, the son of Zebedee. All right, what do we know about this James, the son of Zebedee? Who's Zebedee? This is his dad. That was an easy one, right? Okay, that's why he's called the son of. All right. James is another name for Jacob. This is one of those weird translations, is how things change over time, but this is the Hebrew name and the Greek name for Jacob. Okay? So anytime you read about a James in the Bible, you're reading about a Jacob in the Bible. And obviously the name Jacob is a famous name to have, or something that a lot of parents would name their children, because you're naming it after the father of the 12 tribes, who is Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. Okay? So he is a Jacob. He is the brother of John, which we'll find out here in just a moment. And because John is mentioned second and is called the brother of James, more than likely James is what? He's the older brother, okay? He may have been a bigger guy also because of another James that's going to be mentioned later on. In fact, there is a popular TV show out right now called The Chosen that talks about the disciples, and throughout that TV series, this James is referred to as Big James. And it may be that he was bigger in stature, or it may be he just might be older than the other James that is there. He is also known as a son of thunder. This probably has something to do with his personality, just like his brother John. And one of his claims to fame, if you will, is that he and his brother asked Jesus if they should rain down hellfire, basically, and destroy a city that was not hospitable to them. I don't think they get the whole disciple thing yet, right? Okay, so that is definitely one of his claims to fame. What are some other claims to fame with James? Yes, sir. Yeah. So there's many discussions throughout the gospel, especially we'll look in the Gospel of Mark later on another time, about this idea of greatness and this idea of the kingdom and their misunderstanding of the kingdom. And there is one occasion where the mother of James and John come to Jesus and basically ask about whether his sons, her sons, can sit on his right hand and his left hand. And of course, there is some interesting foreshadowing and interlude there, if you will. And Jesus says, you don't want to be on my right and left hand, because we realize what that means in his glory is that he's on the cross, and there are people on his left and right that are also on crosses. Okay? But definitely that is another one of his claims to fame. Anything else about James? Yes. All right, death. He is the first apostle to be martyred. In Acts chapter 12, he is killed by the sword. More than likely, that means he is beheaded. All right? And so he is the first apostle to be martyred. It is after that he is martyred that Peter is also in prison. So you just assume that Peter is going to be next. But the people have a prayer meeting. And at this prayer meeting, they pray for Peter's release. And of course, Peter is released from the prison by angels, and he goes and he knocks on the very door of where they're having the prayer meeting, and they won't let him in because they're having a prayer meeting. Not realizing that Peter, it's not his ghost that is there, as some translations have it, but instead it is actually Peter. But yes, James is also a claim to fame, is that he is the first apostle that is martyred or is killed for his faith. All right, moving on. John, the brother of James. And as I already mentioned, because it is the brother of James, more than likely he is younger. His name is simply just John, but John is one of those names that's a very popular name also in the first century. Claims to fame with John. There's lots. Say what? He outlived them all. Okay? Tradition tells us, and we'll get to that point here in a minute, that his death, he was someone who died of an old age and not of martyrdom like perhaps the rest of the apostles. What else about John? Yes, sir. Okay, the book of Revelation, he is given this vision. He is in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, being Sunday, and he receives all of these visions, and he is told to write them down. And thankfully, he writes them down, and that is where we have the book of Revelation. He not only writes the book of Revelation, but what other books does he write? All right, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then also G. John, or the Gospel of John. Now, technically, the Gospel of John, like the other Gospels, are anonymous. They are not, the author never says who they are. The Gospel of John, the author says who he is. He says he is the disciple whom Jesus loved. But he never tells us who the disciple whom Jesus loved is. But you can kind of guess that it can only be one or two people, and then you eventually get to John, and then also tradition, a very, very, very old tradition. We're talking like early 2nd century tradition tells us that John wrote the gospel that bears his name. Okay, so the Gospel of John, and more than likely he is therefore the disciple, the one in the book, the one whom Jesus loved. One fact I forgot to mention about Peter is Peter also traditionally wrote a gospel. That gospel is called Mark. Okay? He did not write it. John Mark wrote it, but John Mark wrote it with Peter's help. The story goes that Peter would dictate or tell Mark stories about Jesus, because remember, John Mark, he wasn't around for the time of Jesus. He came later on in the world. He did not walk with Jesus to tell us all these stories, and tradition tells us that Peter is the one who tells him the stories that John Mark then writes down, where we have our Gospel of Mark. And if that is true, it is very interesting how Peter is portrayed in Mark, sometimes differently than how he's portrayed in Matthew, Luke, and John. That's another study for another time. Okay, writings, the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then also the book of Revelation. More than likely, he's a disciple whom Jesus loved. He died, it seems to be, of old age. He became known as the elder. That's what he even refers to himself as. Sometimes he talks about the Christians as my little children several times in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. He is also the apostle of love. This man writes more about love than any other of our New Testament writers. Yes, sir. Definitely so. So one of the claims of fame of Peter, James, and John as being part of the inner circle is that they were part of the Mount of Transfiguration. There in Matthew and in chapter 17, Mark and in chapter 9. They are part of that inner group. They get invited to go to the mountain and see the transfiguration, hearing the very voice of God. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him. Okay? So now we're leaving the best well-known three, and we're going to move to the other ones. All right, Andrew. All right, fun fact, Andrew is my favorite of the apostles, but I also have a brother named Andrew who is named after this apostle. Okay? Andrew is Peter's brother, and more than likely, as I mentioned, he is Peter's younger brother. Andrew is a fisherman, just like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, or Peter, James, and John were fishermen. In fact, they all seem to work in the same little fishing business, which was perhaps run by a guy by the name of Zebedee, who was James and John's dad. Okay? What is Andrew's claims to fame? Andrew is a bringer. Okay? Andrew is a bringer. Every time we see Andrew, he is bringing somebody to Jesus. Andrew, first of all, brings who to Jesus? His brother, Peter. Peter, the reason why Peter is an apostle at all is because his little brother brought him to Jesus. Andrew also brings somebody else to Jesus that makes for one of the most famous miracle stories that we read about in the New Testament. In fact, I think, yes, other than obviously the resurrection, it is the only miracle story that is mentioned in all four Gospels. All right, the feeding of the 5,000. Guess who brought the lad with the lunch? It was Andrew. Andrew says there in John chapter 6, there is a lad here. And he brings him to Jesus. And then the third time in John chapter 12, there are some Greeks who make the famous statement, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." And Philip hears about this, and for whatever reason, Philip goes and finds Andrew, and Andrew then takes those Greeks to Jesus. So Andrew's claim to fame is that he is a bringer. Be like Andrew, okay? Death. How does Andrew die? It's not in the Bible, okay? This is just tradition. All of these are tradition as far as the death is concerned. All right, he is crucified, but not on a cross like this. He is crucified on an X cross. which is still to this day known as the Cross of Andrew. So if you see flags sometimes with that X cross, that is the Cross of Andrew, and that is supposedly how Andrew died. All right, now we have Philip, which is spelled the correct way with one L, right? No, Philip? Okay. Spelled the incorrect way with one L, okay? So Philip, what do we know about Philip? Okay. Yes, we do know about Philip and the eunuch, but that's not this Philip, okay? And that is a problem that happens throughout history. In fact, you have many writings that go on in the 2nd and 3rd century where people confuse this Philip with the Philip that we read about in Acts, okay? There is another Philip who we refer to as Philip the Evangelist, who is part of the 7 that was chosen there in Acts chapter 6, who are the precursors of deacons, if you will. The same Philip that we read about later on in Acts chapter 8, who has his great sermon with the Ethiopian eunuch, okay? That is not this Philip. This Philip is only mentioned 8 times in the New Testament, and 4 of those times are in the list, okay? As we go through the rest of these names, a lot of these names are not mentioned a lot. Most of the time they're just mentioned in the list. He is from Bethsaida. And the reason why we know he's from Bethsaida is because that is something that is brought out in the text, especially there in John. We'd already mentioned John chapter 12, where Andrew brings these Greeks. Well, the Greeks go to Philip in the first place because he is from Bethsaida. I don't know what connection necessarily that has for him, but Peter and Andrew are also from Bethsaida originally, but later on in life they live in Capernaum there at Peter's mother-in-law's house, or Peter's house where his mother-in-law lives. But there is a connection there. He is not Philip the Evangelist, okay? 2 different Philips, not the same ones, although both are very important. Claims to fame, he seems to have something to do with Nathanael that is brought to Jesus later on. He also is there with the Greeks. There's not a lot else talked about Philip. I'm not saying that he wasn't important, but as far as the stories are concerned, there's not a lot of things about him. And then Philip, he is also reportedly killed upside down on a cross. This is one of those that the traditions are very, very different, and you can read some traditions about this, some traditions about this, and we'll find that out as we go throughout the rest of our list here too. The top 3 we know more about than the rest, okay? Then we have Bartholomew, all right? He has probably the most fun name other than Thaddeus of all of the apostles. We also don't know much about him, but he is probably the same guy as Nathanael that is mentioned in John's gospel. He is always mentioned, so Nathanael and Bartholomew is usually always mentioned in connection to Philip. And then in the list that we find, when Bartholomew is not mentioned, Nathanael is mentioned, okay? Bartholomew probably is more of his nickname, which is probably talking about him being the son of this guy, Bartholomew, right? Whereas his real name perhaps is Nathanael. And he's the one that makes the comment in John chapter 1, can anything good come out of Nazareth? His also perhaps claim to fame is he is the first one to make the confession about Jesus basically being the Son of God there in John chapter 1 also, okay? He believes that Jesus is the Messiah after Jesus just simply says, hey, I saw you sitting under a tree. And he's amazed by that, and so he believes in Jesus. His death is, we don't know this for a fact, but he has the worst of the deaths. Supposedly, he was flayed alive. Okay? So, a fun thing that you can do, not flaying people, okay, but when you Google image search the different apostles and look at some of their old not their old paintings like it's them, painting, but the way people portray them in their paintings, many times they are portrayed with the instrument of their death. Okay? So almost every painting of the Apostle Paul, he always has a sword in his painting. Almost in every painting of the Apostle Bartholomew, he has a knife in his hand, a flaying knife, or some make it even more gross where he actually is holding his skin in the picture. Yeah, that's nasty, isn't it? Okay? But that's what they do a lot of times in their paintings. All right? Matthew. We know a lot about Matthew, but we don't know a lot about Matthew. Okay? Matthew more likely is Levi the tax collector. We talked about him in Mark and in chapter 2 already. He is someone who is hated, obviously. He is of a horrible class of people because of their dishonesty and the hatred that would go along with them because they had basically turned against their own brethren to work for the Roman government. But Levi and Matthew both seem to be the same person. Even though we know his name very well, he is only mentioned 7 times in the New Testament. I find that interesting, that he is only mentioned 7 times. So if there's 4 lists, then he's mentioned 4 times in the list and only 3 times outside of that. Claims to fame, of course, is that traditionally it is Matthew who wrote what? Matthew, the book that we call the Gospel according to Matthew. Again, all the Gospels are technically anonymous. They are not like the letters that are written by Paul, where Paul says, I, Paul, am writing this letter. Instead, they are anonymous, and we can do another lesson about that at some point in time, about perhaps why they are anonymous, but then why we know who wrote them at the same time. Okay? His death. Matthew, we are unsure about his death also, but it seems to be that he was martyred. But tradition, like I said, it changes about all of these. Okay? We'll quickly go through these rest of these and then see if we have any other questions. So next we have Thomas. All right? And what is Thomas's real name? Doubting Thomas, okay? What is his actual given name? Do you realize that Thomas is not his name? Thomas is his nickname. Didymus. You know what Didymus is the same thing as? Thomas. It's just a different language. Okay? So Didymus and Thomas both mean twin. Okay? Tradition tells us his actual first name is Judas. Now, why doesn't anybody call him Judas? Because we already got other Judases, right? And so no wonder Jesus doesn't want to go, hey, Judas, and then 3 guys go, huh? Right? He says, hey, twin. And so that's where Thomas. So he is called the twin, maybe because he has a twin, maybe because he looks like somebody else. I don't know. But his name, at least in tradition, is also Judas, but he's not called that. He's referred to as Doubting Thomas many times, which I think is true, but also we give him a bad rap, perhaps, because while he is the one that is doubting in John chapter 20, he is also one that has great faith in Jesus earlier on. He was one that is willing to go with Jesus and die with him. In John chapter 14, he asks very, very important questions. And because of Thomas doubting, you can know a very important fact about the death of Jesus. And what is that? That he was nailed to the cross. Okay? No gospel writer ever tells us that he was nailed. Paul alludes to it later on where he talks about what in Colossians, how that they were nailed to the cross as far as the writing of ordinances that were against you. But it is only Thomas who says, unless I see the nail prints in his hands and the spear in his side. Of course, we realize that he was speared because of John chapter 19, but still, it is only Thomas that gives us the nail comment. So Next time you see Thomas, thank him for that, because we got a lot of good songs about the nails, right? But we wouldn't have had unless that was him. So claims to fame, what about him doubting? He makes the great confession, the good confession there in John in chapter 20, my Lord and my God, which really is this awesome, as far as the narrative of the Gospel of John is concerned, is the climax of it all. We've gotten to the point where they proclaim that Jesus is Lord and God. As far as his death, I don't know, and no one else knows either, okay? There is like 13 different ways that Thomas supposedly died. Some to say he just died of old age. So we don't know about Thomas. James, the son of Alphaeus. Now what's interesting is Levi's dad is also named Alphaeus, but James and Levi, or Matthew, do not seem to be related. James, the son of Alphaeus, is also known as James what? James the Less. And it may be James the Less because he is younger, or it may be, in a funny way, because he is shorter. Okay? We don't know. But he is referred to sometimes as James the Less. And you obviously, if you have a lot of different Jameses, you need nicknames for people. And so that's why he is referred to as James the Less. We know very, very, very little about this James. We know a whole lot more about a guy by the name of James the Just, or James the brother of Jesus, who writes the book of James later on in our New Testament. But because this guy's name is James, and there's other people named James, throughout history, the Jameses mix up together as far as some of the traditional stories. But we don't actually know a lot about this James. In fact, his claim to fame may be that he's short. That's about all we really know about him. And we also don't know about his death, but more than likely he was martyred. All right. Then we have Thaddeus. Okay. Thaddeus wins for having the most names. All right. So Thaddeus is known as Jude of James, Judas of James, Judas Thaddeus, and Labius, who is surnamed Thaddeus. And then one time, John refers to him as Judas, not Iscariot. So you don't get confused. All right? This guy had a ton of names, but Thaddeus is the one he is called, because can you imagine how confusing it could be if he was called Jude or Jude of James? And then again, you have all the different disciples looking around like, what in the world's going on? Who's he talking to? Right? And so he is referred to as Thaddeus. And as I mentioned, we don't know much about Thaddeus other than he's got the coolest name for a disciple when I was a kid, because I thought Thaddeus sounded like Thaddeus. And so I snickered several times as a child about Thaddeus. Thaddeus. He probably had a tough time growing up. All right. Next we have Simon the Canaanite. All right. This is Mark's. So this is the New King James Version of Mark's account of Simon the Canaanite. Now, with a name like Simon the Canaanite, you may think that Simon is from where? Canaan. But that's not what Canaanite means, okay? Canaanite is a transliteration of a word that means he is a zealot. In fact, in other translations and in other texts, he is referred to as Simon the Zealot. Is he a zealot in that he is part of the fourth group? So Josephus talks about 4 different groups. He talks about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Does that mean that he is part of that fourth group, or part of a precursor of that fourth group? Because that fourth group doesn't really appear fully until later on. Or is he someone who is just zealous? We don't know. But that is what he is referred to as, Simon the Zealot. But don't get caught up on Canaanite. So if you were to look up what the word Canaanite means in a Greek lexicon, it will say zealot or zealous. Okay, so that's just a transliteration of that word. This is as much as we know about him. He is only in the list. He is never mentioned in any other context. And because of that, we don't know much about him. And then finally, we get to Judas Iscariot. Boo. Okay. Judas Iscariot, interestingly enough, in all the lists, guess where Judas is always mentioned? He's the last. Not because he's the baby of the group, but that is because he is the one that is the bad guy, right? He is He is the most infamous of all the disciples. Mark even, again, all the way back in chapter 3, before we even have anything of betrayal, Mark goes ahead and gives it away that this Judas Iscariot is one who is going to betray Jesus. Judas also was the one that was in charge of the money. Why he was in charge of the money, I don't know. But he's in charge of the money, which becomes another theme throughout the Gospels, and he is untrustworthy with the money. In fact, John gives us context later on when he retells these stories and says that basically he was a thief with the money. Of course, is it Luke? I think it's Luke in his account when you have the spikenard that is used to anoint the feet of Jesus, and it is actually Judas who is the one that is upset that the money is not spent, that is not sold, and the money is not given to the poor. And the comments like, yeah, Judas, like you really were caring about the poor because you usually wanted the money. And of course, it is Judas who betrays Jesus for the money, right? For the 30 pieces of silver. And then his death is something we all know. He hung himself, and then his bowels burst asunder, right? And there's the joke about making sure that you do good hermeneutics and you don't take verses out of context, where you go read one verse about how where it says, and Judas went and hung himself, and then you read the next verse, go and do likewise, right? So don't take verses out of context. Keep verses in their context. All right. Any other questions or comments about the 12 disciples? I know that was a lot. Yes, Tarsha. Is Peter the only one that is mentioned that has a wife? Yes and no. Peter is the only one that we know of that has a wife for sure, because he has a mother-in-law, and you know the joke, why have a mother-in-law if you don't have a wife? But Paul, when Paul is defending his apostleship in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 9, he mentions that the other apostles have wives too. But he doesn't say all the apostles have wives, but more than likely all the apostles had wives. It would be very unlikely for them not to have a wife. Okay, that was usually something that would happen. Yes? Yes. Yeah. John takes care of his mother on the cross, and that is in the Gospel of John, chapter 19 also. Yes, Miss Bertha. Why would Judas then have been picked as an apostle? That is a question to answer at another time and not right now, okay? Because he always was one that was going to betray him, but still Jesus picked him. All right, so that is all the time we have for this night. We're now going to enter into a time of worship together.